Welcome, Ed, to our next edition of Seeing Opportunity in Devastation Stories to Inspire. And what we're talking about as a running theme is how to recognize, stay in a seller's market, and so many different aspects about this seller's market. And today, Ed is going to touch on last week we spoke about realizing when you hit rock bottom and what to do when you do. So now it is going to go to the opposite end of hitting rock bottom, and that is basically you are in demand. You've hit your sweet spot, if I can call it that way, in the seller's market. Now, what happens? And Ed, welcome once again, and it's over to you.
Thanks, Jacques. Yeah, let's just reiterate. Um, we've got broadly speaking two types of market. Either the buyers are dominant, there are um, less of them than there are sellers. There are plenty of vendors. There's not enough demand to satisfy all of the suppliers. The buyers can pick and choose. The market is generally characterized by very high levels of competition. It is characterized by probably quite thin margins, continued price pressure. Among the vendors, there might be quite bitter struggles with people trying to acquire the best staff skills and the best product ranges and so on at the cost of others. It also might be characterized by quite vicious competition where the vendors try to take out competitors, overwhelm them or buy them or push them out of business because it's a dog eat dog kind of market. The other half of the market is seller's market, and that is where there's not enough vendors to satisfy the demand. Very high demand, not enough product or service to go into that demand. The sellers can literally pick and choose buyers, and the buyers are prepared to pay a premium price to get to the right seller, and relatively low levels of competition. Now, I must stress that these aren't sort of a black band and a white band or a red band and a blue band or something like that. It's a graduation scale from the bottom end of the buyer's market, which is a real dog eat dog and very low chances of business survival, to the top end of the market where there are people who are totally and completely exclusive. You may have a single vendor that is not under any kind of threat and will continue there for as long as they produce the goods that the market wants. And there are all the graduations in between. So we talked last week, as Jacques, as you said, about when you're down the bottom end of the buyer's market. I want to talk a little bit today about getting into the seller's market and then staying there. So, first step, if you look around at most businesses today, and it literally doesn't matter very much whether you're in a major construction group or a mining group or a, um, a major property developer or you're a street hawker or a retailer, most people are in a bit of a buyer's market. There are lots of options for buyers to buy from. They have a choice of where to go. The competition is probably quite severe, and the margins you have to watch very carefully. And if you don't think that I'm right, try opening a small supermarket and competing with the likes of the big chains, or a small pizza takeaway, and see whether you can be competitive with all of the franchise pizza places or whatever. So most people are in that sort of buyer's market. If you're an individual and you haven't got the muscle of a big franchisor or a major corporation and you want to get out of that market, how do you actually do it? Well, there's two broad ways. The one way is to specialize. And I had a wonderful example of that recently. Um, I met a photographer, and the photographer takes pictures of houses. And he does that for estate agents and for owners wishing to sell their houses. Not just houses, properties of all descriptions. He's a property photographer, and he's a really, really good property photographer. And while he was photographing my home, because my home is on the market at the moment, um, we got chatting as one does, and he has a huge interest in a particular item. And I happened to have some with him that I wasn't particularly interested in, so I gave them to him. And he refused to take them. He said he wanted to pay for them, and I said, I don't want any money for them. But I'll tell you what, just take a head and shoulders photo of me that I can use on the likes of Clubhouse. And he said, cool. So he came back and he took some head and shoulders photos of me. And they are technically very, very competent. But they really aren't great photos. You know, they don't, they're not portraiture because he's not a portrait photographer. He's a house photographer. And lovely man though he is, I realized I'd made a mistake. I was asking him to do something which he doesn't really have any expertise in. So, I've got a couple of these sort of slightly wooden photographs. And I thought, well, here's something that I've learned as a lesson and something I can speak about on Clubhouse. And that is that here's this guy who has made a speciality and he is in enormous demand by all the big estate agents to do all their house photography. And I was asking him to do something outside his field, and he did it very willingly, but he wasn't great at it because that wasn't his interest in life. He's carved himself a niche as a property photographer. And he has moved, and you know how many photographers there are around. And many of them are generous. They do weddings and they do portraiture and they do baby pictures and they do all sorts. And some property photography in the meanwhile. And generally speaking, they're competent at all of those, but they're not brilliant. Now, this guy is brilliant at property photography, and that's how he's created himself into a seller's market. One standalone photographer, all on his own, with his own equipment. Moved straight out of the very, very crowded buyer's market of the average standalone photographer and moved straight into a different space. Nice exercise, but it doesn't have to be at the bottom. It can be well up the line. I think we've talked on here about networking group where they decided that there was an underserviced market, which is the sort of small medium enterprise internet connectivity market, and they set themselves up to service that market. And they actually set a limit on it. They put um, a firm, hard limit either around it. So if you were below a certain number of connected units, they wouldn't talk to you. They didn't have the skills to. If you were above a certain number of connected units, connected devices to the internet, they wouldn't talk to you because you were outside their limits. Now that's tough. They were approached by people with thousands, maybe tens of thousands of connected users, begging them to look after their internet connectivity. And they had to say, no thanks, even if the income was 1 million or a couple of million a month. They said, no thanks. Now that's tough to do. They'd set hard limits. And the net upshot of that is that the average growth rate over the past probably 8 or 10 years has been somewhere around 40% per annum and have continued right through the COVID pandemic, still growing, still developing on the acquisition trail, acquiring other quite substantial companies, and they still have their limits. They will not breach them. If you're outside their limits, don't talk to them. That's tough working, Jacques, because
Yes.
like most of us, you and I, we might get tempted to say, that's not really in my field, but man, there's so much money there. Am I tempted to go and do it? Now, these guys weren't. They stuck to their knitting and they grew like mushrooms in a very, very competitive market. I mean, internet service providers, you trip over every time you turn around. There's hundreds of people. How many people sort of phone canvas or send SMSs or emails or something telling about the virtues of their network services in any one week? They got themselves out of that space into totally a different space. And these were two guys who started on their own, no customers. So it there's a bigger example, and there are other even more major examples. If you look at some of the uh, construction companies that have focused on a single area of construction. They only do, I don't know, power stations, or they only do dams. That's all that they ever do. Or they only do um, police stations. That's all they ever do. And they become the expert there. Now, that's a tough way to break out of the buyer's market because, especially when times are tough, you're going to be very, very tempted to take whatever comes along. But it's a way that has proved beneficial to many people. Other way of breaking out of the buyer's market is to develop a speciality and to become someone um, who specializes in a significant area. Now, to some degree, the photographer I talked about before had done that. He'd specialized and had become expert in property photography. But it may be that the horse or the cart came first. He may have decided he wanted to go into that field and then developed his expertise, or he may have specifically developed an expertise in that field and then entered it. And you see this kind of expertise led move out of the buyer's market in fields like medical practice, where certain medical practitioners will only do certain types of medicine. They study it, they become very expert in that field, they get all the qualifications and diplomas and everything, and then they only focus on that. And there are many examples of doctors who only deal with things like infertility or only deal with certain types of surgery or only deal with whatever. And you see it equally in a lot of other areas where a company, especially in areas like engineering, where a company will use their know how to develop products that nobody else can develop. Their technology will be streets ahead of anybody else's because they've become uh, a technically focused organization that has put their expertise into developing at that level. So in engineering, I think you find that in so many fields. If you look in the supercar field, you will find many such examples where people have developed a for a particular purpose into a narrow market, and they've satisfied the needs in that tiny little market, and they're making a lot of money out of it. I think there have been in the last during this year there have been at least a couple of cars in launch that look like pretty close to ordinary SUVs, but are the uh, fairly close to supercars under the bonnet, and they sell for around 4 million rand. Now that's a very narrow niche market there. There's not a lot of competition in that stratosphere. It might be a very small market, but you don't have a lot of you don't have people walking up and down the street and making comparisons between the 4 million rand vehicles. You have one or two competitors and that's it, and they probably are all in the same kind of league. So many examples across the board, from individuals to professionals to um, manufacturing organizations to uh, restaurants. How many restaurants do you know that will focus only in a particular area? They develop a absolute speciality in that area and they won't move away. There was a restaurant not far from me which was called the Eastern Frontier, and their speciality was selling ribs. And you could go there and you could buy a steak or a burger or plate of fish or something like that, which was fair, to be honest, fairly ordinary. But their ribs were just out of this world. And people would come from 20 kilometers away to eat ribs at that particular restaurant because that's what they'd made their area of expertise. So, two ways of doing it: develop a specialist skill or find a niche that you can become an authority in and drive yourself out of the buyer's market. There are probably other ways as well. There's certainly businesses that have done it on their service level, where their service level is just so much above the standard of anything that you've ever seen before that they set themselves aside as someone unique. And I think you can look around in the restaurant industry and in the hospitality industry and find some of those. Many businesses, maybe even most businesses, would say wistfully, yeah, I would actually like to do a bit better than I'm doing. I think I could say that, and I'm sure that many other business people around could say that. So recognize where you are, decide if you're okay with that. If you're not okay with that, then start thinking about some of these ideas of how you can move yourself forward. Okay, so let's say that we are successful. We now move ourselves into that highly desirable seller's market where the buyers are clamoring to get our goods. And our biggest problem is getting the money into the bank fast enough. That's a nice problem to have. So we sit there and we are very successful, and we know exactly what we're doing in that marketplace, and we do it very well. Now, one of two things are going to happen. One of three things are going to happen. Firstly, people will look at you and say, hey, that guy's making a lot of money. Now, why don't I just do exactly what they are doing and make the same amount of money? And unless your solution is technology based, so it can't easily be copied, and don't rely on technology not being copied these days. It's that doesn't really happen too often. Um, Everything can be copied. If you're a famous author and you've got copyright on your works and everybody wants to buy your books, well, yeah, maybe you're immune at that stage. Although people will write books in the same style to try and capture some of your market. But any other circumstance, if you're in the top of the market, you're liable to attract competitors. And what you might well have be doing is creating a new buyer's market all around you, as more and more people do pretty well the same things that you're doing. So you have to watch your competition like a hawk, and you continually have to be ahead of all newcomers into your space in the marketplace, which means you have to have the market intel to know that there are people in your space in the market. And then the second area where you have to be very good is what I call the FDH area, where you get very, very complacent and you become, in my terms, fat, dumb, and happy. The money's rolling in, and you don't have to put in the same intensity into your business as you did in the past. And you can just let it roll on pretty well as it is and sit back and enjoy your gains and maybe take a little focus off the business and maybe get a bit bored and put a focus somewhere else. Be very careful of the FDH situation. If you're in that situation, get out of the business, promote someone to run it or own it, sell the business, get out and do something different which excites you. If you stay there, you risk one of these stupendous crashes that happen from time to time. Probably the most obvious example of that is the restaurant that's the flavor of the month. And it stays the flavor of the month for maybe 2, 3 years. And suddenly a new one opens up around the corner, and the old restaurant's not the flavor of the month. And a year later, it closes down. Now that's sad because at one time there was a queue forming outside the door. You you had to be some sort of society animal even to get a booking, let alone a good table. And then suddenly no one wants to eat there. That's sad. That's really sad. And yet it happens time and time and time again. Buyers are fickle. Buyers will look for their advantage today. And if their advantage is being seen at the latest trendy spot, you better keep yourself the latest trendy spot. Otherwise, the buyers aren't going to be there. And that means that you probably have to keep reinventing yourself over and over again. But if you just stick where you were and you become the fat, dumb, and happy owner, it's going to happen to you. And sadly, you're liable to lose everything that you've gained in a sense of shock. And that would be sad. That would be wrong. So, if you're staying at the top, the first rule is to remember why you got there and how you got there, and recognize that what you did, others can do. And so you better keep doing that if you want to stay in that business. So when you get to that, you take the next step up. You make yourself yet more unique, more in demand. And as soon as that's bedded down, you take the next step up and say you settle in more. If you look at a company like Apple, Apple is a master at this, continually reinventing this innovation, this fantastic change in the world, in the technology that they offer, continuously. Some of their stuff, which is a couple of years old, is a bit tired. Nobody would buy that anymore. But they don't fall off the top of the ladder. They stick with their perch. And so many others, down to the the surgeon that has a queue of people waiting for their services. And I know of one of those, a specialist, where it'll take you on average a year to get an appointment just to see him, on average. So, if you're down at the bottom, or anywhere in the middle, or even in the seller's market, rule one, identify you where you are. Rule two, make a decision. You want to stay there, you want to move out. If you want to move out of it, make a plan. Can be skills based, can be niche based, can be geography based, or a whole lot of other areas. And then once you get there, that's when your struggle starts, not when it finishes. And enjoy. Hope it makes you lots and lots and lots of money.
Thank you, Ed. That was very special. And for those of you listening to us, if you want to have access to this recording, we publish it on the Griffin Enterprise Development channel. where you will find episode 7, where it will be entitled "Getting into a Seller's Market and Staying There." And like with everything else, if you hear but you don't apply, there will be no change. You will keep on doing what you're doing. Working harder is not going to help, only smarter. And the things that Ed is reminding us of, these things cannot be considered to be rocket science, difficult to understand, comprehend. But it's so simple that we sometimes overlook them. But sticking to your knitting, listening to the practical tips that it is giving us, and then applying it. So I'm just going to really encourage you, as you hear these, just even if you apply one thing at a time and apply it diligently, then notice how that changes what you do for your business. So thank you, everyone. And as usual, again, I want to thank Ed for sharing the stories, Ed. And as usual, we are very engaged when you do so, because we can then relate, as far as our own businesses are concerned. So, and for the others present, thank you very much for your attention and supporting us. And see you until next week.